Hola, bona tarda, good evening, ni hao, buenas tardes. Gracias a todos por venir, sobre todo gracias, lo primero, aparte obviamente del primero de todos, que es el conferenciante invitado que tenemos esta tarde, que es Neil McWilliam, del cual os voy a hablar sin unas 4 palabras. Muchas gracias, lo primero, a Raquel Bouso por haber tenido la amabilidad y la generosidad de insertar esta conferencia en la clase que estáis teniendo con ella. Espero que dentro de esta clase metodológica y, para decirlo de una manera pedante, propedéutica, en la que estáis metidos, embarcados y embarcadas, esta conferencia os pueda servir para iluminar algunas de las cuestiones sobre metodología de investigación en historia del arte, sobre historiografía, a la vez que para aquellos de vosotros que estáis interesados en la historia del arte moderno, en especial la historia del arte del siglo XIX, vista desde desde una perspectiva no necesariamente formal, sino de la de los estudios de cultura visual y unos estudios de historia social, os será de interés y os puede abrir nuevas visiones sobre la disciplina y sobre vuestros propios intereses. Voy a ser muy breve, me gustaría simplemente presentar a Neil McWilliam. I'm just now introducing you. Okay. Neil McWilliam es un profesor y un historiador del arte, yo creo que de los más importantes en su generación, y que ha escrito algunos textos importantísimos desde los años 70 hacia aquí. En estos momentos es profesor en la Duke University, en Chapel Hill, en el estado de Carolina del Norte, en Estados Unidos. Y lo que me ha interesado y creo que es muy importante y que tiene mucha relación con nuestros propios estudios interdisciplinarios, híbridos, mixtos, es poder hablar o poder escuchar a un historiador del arte que reflexiona sobre cuestiones como la tradición, la ideología, el nacionalismo, algunas nociones tales como el arte social, la crítica social del arte y cómo relaciona todas estas cuestiones las unas con las otras. Yo descubrí, I'm turning into English because that becomes personal, not too much. I'm sorry. It's just that I think that the first time I saw your name on a book was with the Salon criticism books. What was the Salon criticism books? For those of us, or for much of us who are studying art criticism as such, understood as an object of study as such, it was a barren field. There was nothing. We had to pick out things, reading a lot of newspapers, spending hours and hours in French libraries, looking at microfilms, and that was really tiring, exhausting, boring, and it brought little fruit at the end. And then came people like Neil McWilliam writing, and this compilation of all what has been written in art criticism in the 19th century, in the different periods of the 19th century, exactly precisely written by author, the title of the article, the name of the periodical when it came, the pages, the days, and then the quote. I think there was the quote even, so la marca, no, of the library, so that we had everything. It was unfortunate that by that time when the book appeared, I had already written my doctoral dissertation. So it was a pity that it was not written 2 years ago, 2 years before, but that was a very groundbreaking work in the historiography of 19th century, and especially also considering art criticism and the discourses about art as an integral and inherent part of the art historical discipline. Since then, obviously, much has been written by Neil McWilliam. I just want you to keep in mind that he has been compiling the correspondence of painters as important as Émile Bernard. He has been also working on the École de Pont-Aven, and maybe Émile Bernard and Pont-Aven doesn't tell you much, but they were Paul's friends of Gauguin at the moment he was still staying in Brittany, and he has also published very recently 2 volumes on the histories, the social histoire sociale, histoire de l'histoire sociale de l'art, 2 volumes in French on this very specific topic of social art history, which is again a very important parcel of art history in the last quarter of the 20th century. So I think that it's a luxury to have him here, and we are really very glad to hear what he has come to tell us today, and just keep your minds awakened to make a lot of questions in at the end of his lecture.
Well, thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much indeed. That was very nice of you. And I can tell you the luxury is mine. It really is very nice to be here, and thank you very much for the invitation. What I want to talk about today forms one part of a much bigger study that I've been engaged in for quite a long time now, which is now finished and, all being well, will be published next year, on cultural nationalism in very late 19th, early 20th century France, really from the 1890s down to the First World War. I've been interested in cultural nationalism for a long time, and unfortunately, over the period that my interest has been at its peak, nationalism has gone from the fringes of contemporary political life to, in some respects, its center. Many countries in Europe and also in the United States. So it's become a horribly topical subject. What I want to talk about today in relation to attitudes towards tradition comes into that topic to some extent at an angle, at a tangent, looking at the ways in which particular genealogies of French art, particular ways of thinking about the history of French art in the late 19th and early 20th centuries are irrevocably fixed within certain ideological and artistic positions. And it's the ideology of tradition and the ways in which perceptions of the past change over this period that'll be the center of what I want to talk about. And again, bearing in mind that many of you aren't art historians, I think it's important to bear in mind that what I'm talking about in relation to artistic practice and the history of art, the historiography of art and art criticism, is really representative of broader changes in attitudes towards national culture and the relationship between culture and national identity that are occurring in France during these years, but also one could, I think, find similar instances of parallel phenomena in other parts of Europe at the same period. But anyway, that's, if you like, that's the methodological or the historical, historiographical frame within which what I want to talk about actually works. Now then, here I just sort of press on the right. Yeah. Okay, so let's get started. No.
Wait.
No, it's not that.
So if you do like
on
that,
the left.
like
Okay.
that, so now we are going to put the, right, you
Okay.
just press here,
Fine,
and that
that's
will
good.
be that.
Lovely. Okay. In September 1925, the Petit Palais in Paris unveiled a major work by the painter Maurice Denis, that you see here, a decorated cupola illustrating the history of French art from the Middle Ages to the present day. Commissioned 7 years earlier, the artist had initially considered honoring France's victory over Germany, but soon opted for a panoramic narrative that began with Saint Louis and the flowering of Gothic in Paris and Chartres, which you can see in the top, left-hand corner. These sort of run across chronologically. Began with the flowering of Gothic in Paris and Chartres, and ended with Renoir, Cézanne, and Degas working in the shadow of the recently completed Sacré-Cœur. Admiring Denis' achievement, critic Paul Léon described the cupula's subject as, quote, the history, the triumph of our national art, and judged its stylistic clarity expressive of the tradition it celebrated. Quote, everything is perfectly clear and legible, not the slightest confusion. Delicacy, taste, moderation, the very expression of French genius. Denis' cupola had been contracted by the Petit Palais' director, Henri Lepose, author of a biography of Ingres and founder in 1918 of La Renaissance de l'art français et des industries de luxe, a publication dedicated to restoring the nation's dominance in the visual and decorative arts following France's military defeat of Germany. In its first issue, Lepose's associate, Arsène Alexandre, warned of what he claimed was an unprecedented crisis in French art. Seduced by the perverse attraction of foreign schools, he claimed, contemporaries ignored the superior merits of the country's own production, either misjudging its character or disregarding it altogether. Quote, they have often confused a false tradition with the real one, while at the other extreme, the brash, the tormented, and the ignorant confuse true innovation with artificiality, incompleteness, and the grotesque, end quote. As a consequence, the French school had been compromised by what he calls banal and boring academicism on the one hand, and by, quote, a sickly and aridly violent excess on the other. Since its inauguration with a huge retrospective of French decorative art at the 1900 Universal Exhibition, the Petit Palais had helped to combat these destructive tendencies. Transferred to city control in 1901, under Lepose, the museum mounted shows dedicated to Ingres in 1911, David and his students in 1913, French illustrators since the 18th century in 1919, 18th century Petit Maître in 1920, Pierre-Paul Prud'hon in 1922, and French landscape from Poussin to Corot, an exhibition that closed shortly before Denis' mural was unveiled. The municipal collection, which you see here, predominantly made up of works purchased since the 1890s, featured only a handful of artists celebrated by Denis: Courbet, Daumier, Manet, and Renoir. They're all on the cupola, which we'll see again in a moment. And was dominated by Salon favorites, such as Léon Bonnat and Alfred Roll, with whom he had little sympathy. Despite these limitations, Lapose praised the collection as, quote, an incomparable refuge of beauty that conveyed essential lessons to the casual amateur and the aspiring artist. Quote, this is Lapose, that genius demands long patience, that in art, as in other things, hasty improvisation is the greatest danger, and that those lucky enough to mark their passage on earth with a firm imprint truly put the best of themselves in works which they have taken up and abandoned 20 times before finally entrusting them to their destiny, still warm with the emotion that created them. The museum's high point, adjacent to Denis' Rotunda, was the collection that the Dutuit brothers had bequeathed to the city in 1902, and which consisted of an exceptional array of pre-modern decorative art, prints, and old master paintings. Rich with canvases by Rembrandt and the Dutch masters, it also boasted major works by Poussin, The Massacre of the Innocents that you see here, Watteau, and Fragonard, thus giving some sense of earlier moments in the lineage outlined in Denis' pantheon of French masters. Denis was not the first to undertake such a celebration of France's artistic heritage. In 1866, the painter Charles-Louis Muller completed an ambitious decorative ensemble for the recently built Salon de Nantes in the Louvre. This is a huge ceiling decoration over one of the main staircases in the Louvre. It's been recently restored, but as you can see, it's rather hard to decode the individual elements. The ceiling groups painters, sculptors, and architects in 4 monumental lunettes, articulated around rulers who personify, whose patronage defined their eras. Saint Louis, shown with Gothic artisans, François I, with Italian masters, including Rosso, Primaticcio, and Leonardo, who were credited with inspiring French artists, such as Jean Goujon and Germain Pillon, Louis XIV, with French classicists such as Poussin, Claude Lorrain, Charles Lebrun, and André Le Nôtre, and finally, Napoleon I, with such leading figures as David, Girodet, Gros, and Ingres. Though divided into 6 smaller, contiguous spaces, Denis' composition loosely adopts a similar structure. Both Saint Louis and Louis XIV are shown surrounded by artists. François I, in the top right, somewhat perhaps surprisingly, monopolizes the space devoted to the 16th century and is accompanied by allegorical figures, which indirectly evoke Italian influence at the chateau of Fontainebleau, which you can see behind the king himself. The largest expanse, 2 lunettes, devoted to the century since the Revolution, substitutes Delacroix's Liberty, who you can see in the central photograph here, flourishing the French flag, substitutes Liberty for a specific ruler, though a diminutive likeness of Napoleon, copied from Gros' painting, The Battle of Eylau, lurks in the background, with Rude's group of statues, the Marseillaise, on the Arc de Triomphe, towering above him. Müller's ceiling in the Louvre coincided with growing interest during the Second Empire, the 1850s and 60s, in France's standing as a major force in European art since the 12th century. Some 50 years later, Denis' intervention came at a time when the whole idea of tradition, whether French or Western European, was coming under increasing pressure. not only with the emergence of the forces that Arsène Alexandre criticized in 1918, but also because of the past's implication in bitter cultural and political disputes that had raged since the turn of the century. Historians have made much of these conflicts in the years following the Great War, with the so-called idea of the return to order, the rappel à l'ordre. But the armistice in 1918 merely marked the end of a brief pause in a vigorous debate revolving around France's character as a nation, the role of history in forging this putative character, and the art's status, both in embodying and transmitting cultural value and shared identity. Denis himself, a painter deeply conscious of the past and its potential as a resource for creative renewal, was well placed to provide a historical overview, broadly in keeping with the conservative opinions of La Pose. As a figure who'd been politically active in royalist politics and in Catholic circles since the early 1900s, Denis understood the broader stakes in defining a French artistic genealogy. Stakes which, as we will see later, helped shape his conception of the history of French art. Yet before returning to the Petit Palais, we will make an excursion to the Louvre to explore the disputed status of tradition, broadly understood, across the long 19th century, by which, I mean, I'm actually going to go right back to the 17th century, but the period I'm looking at essentially is from the French Revolution in the 1790s down to the second decade of the 20th century, around the First World War. By evaluating the substantial changes that occurred in ways of thinking about contemporary artists' relationship with the past, we can better understand why tradition, conceived as a universal value, was gradually eclipsed by a national genealogy rooted in ethnically influenced conceptions of French culture. Let us start by following Denis on a visit to the Louvre, undertaken as a 13-year-old schoolboy on one Wednesday afternoon in 1894. As recorded in his diary, the experience proved disconcerting. Quote, "I reached the museum at 3. No sign of a guard, not a living atom. Me, just me, in the midst of the immensity. I confess that finding oneself alone, face to face with the past, produces a terrible feeling." Denis' uneasiness, confronted by the overpowering presence of the past, would have struck a chord with many 19th century artists, considering their place within the unfolding history of art since the Hellenistic era. Following the lead of literary historian Harold Bloom, scholars such as Norman Bryson and Mark Gottlieb have analyzed what the latter has called the plight of emulation, a sense of arriving on the scene when the legacy of tradition apparently prevents any further developments of art's technical resources or conceptual range. This notion of belatedness. Haunted by what Harold Bloom describes as a feeling of belatedness, 19th century artists as diverse as Horace Vernet, Ernest Meissonier, and Henri Regnault are diagnosed by art historians today as being significantly disabled by the burden of past achievement. In support of such a claim, historians cite remarks such as the painter Paul de la Roche's despairing complaint, I quote, "The great masters have exploited the field of poetic invention so successfully that there's hardly anything to be gleaned in their traces but a few scraps. From now on, the harvest is over." Historians also mention abortive or allegedly compromised schemes like murals for the Panthéon, commissioned from the painter Paul Chenevert in 1848, or Paul Baudry's completed decor for the Paris Opera, completed under the Second Empire. In both cases, there's been a lot of discussion about why these projects either never got off the ground, as is the case with Chenevert on the left, or why in some ways the works might be considered as demonstrating the artist's uneasy relationship with the past, which has been the case in writings on Baudry. At the same time, one could just as well point to projects by figures such as Eugène Delacroix or Pierre Puvis-Chavannes as having harnessed the past in works of great ambition and confidence. I think there's a way in which, in a sense, the historians have tended to sort of dramatize this notion, this idea of the plight of emulation in ways which give a somewhat distorted view of artists' ability to work productively with the past during this period. As it had been incorporated into French aesthetic theory since the 17th century, the art of the past had been understood as a fertile source of inspiration, rather than as an obstacle to fresh achievement. Emulation and imitation, understood as active selection of past masters' particular strengths, rather than thoughtless copying, were cornerstones of teaching within the Academy following its establishment by Louis XIV in 1648. In L'Art de Peinture of 1673, the painter and critic Charles-Alphonse Dufresnoy extolled the Bolognese master Annibale Carracci for having combined the qualities of such eminent forerunners as Raphael, Titian, Michelangelo, and Correggio to, quote, produce a sort of essence which he transformed into his own substance. And this is, if you like, the model of emulation, combining but coming up with something new, using tradition in a positive, generative way. The critical eclecticism promoted here itself draws upon Vasari's explanation of Raphael's own excellence. And here I'm quoting Vasari. By studying the works of other masters, both the old and the new, out of many manners he made one, which was looked upon ever afterwards as his own. This proved influential in fostering a pedagogy in which the students absorbed lessons from past models that aided mastery of technical skills and developed conceptual sophistication. An exercise such as Roger de Pile's Balance des Peintres of 1788, which compared 56 painters' strengths in composition, drawing, color, and expression according to a numerical scale, offered both students and connoisseurs an apparently nuanced tool, engaging masters' comparative skills in the fundamentals of art. De Pile's inclusion of artists from diverse schools, as well as of contemporary French masters, Sébastien Bourdon and Charles Lebrun, gestured towards an openness that encouraged the novice to look beyond the established canon of classical sculpture and the Italian school, the idea being that contemporaries like Bourdon and Lebrun had absorbed lessons from the past, and they themselves, in their turn, could be regarded as masters to a rising generation. So tradition is a constantly renewed process, like a relay race where one generation of artists takes over from another. Dufresnoy, De Pile, and their successors all agreed that copying the work of the masters offered insight into understanding how they'd achieved excellence. At the same time, though, they strongly discouraged students from attempting to produce an exact replica of an original work. Since copying was said to frustrate the sorts of insight that only active emulation could provide, as the copyist tried to surpass the original and repair its defects. The painter Antoine Coipel, in a lecture to the Academy in 1708, compares this process to Virgil imitating Homer, and to Racine, in his turn, drawing upon Homer, Virgil, Euripides, and Sophocles. I quote Coipel. He says, "Happy he who can draw from this abundant source of riches, who can choose well, and placing them appropriately, becomes, so to speak, original through imitating these great originals." In the end, though, familiarity with the art of the past was considered a means to an end. A heightened appreciation of nature, whose laws the ancients and the great masters had most thoroughly understood. The rules of art, relating to perspective, anatomy, composition, and the like, were to be mastered not as the foundations of a prescriptive academic dogma, but as what was thought to be the necessary basis for a practice more flexible and eclectic than it is often judged to have been by historians today. Though changing personnel within the Academy and guidance by the Directeur Général des Bâtiments du Roi, the General Director of the King's Buildings, the Crown's chief point of contact with the art world, meant that attitudes towards tradition fluctuated across the 18th century. It's in the 1780s that more fundamental transformations began to affect not only the elite organization and its tuition, but also approaches to the art of the past more generally. In 1766, a French translation of J.J. Winckelmann's History of Ancient Art had appeared in Amsterdam. That's the copy on the left. So inaccurate that it drew protests from the author. In 1781, a second attempt, published in Leipzig, was greeted with breathless enthusiasm. Dominique Garat, writing in the publication Mercure de France, marveled, quote, "Does it not seem as if we are listening to one of those prophets to whom eternal beauties have been revealed? Is this not the language of a mortal emerging from the presence of his God?" Winckelmann's reception in France helped enhance the already considerable prestige of antique art, elevating Platonic notions of the beau idéal, ideal beauty, as the doctrinal foundation of a classical aesthetic that during the Revolution won further praise because of the German writer's equation of artistic excellence with political liberty. Winckelmann's admirers argued that the decline of contemporary art shadowed the widespread corruption of the society for which it was produced. It was taken pretty much for granted that everything since Raphael had been on a sort of scale, a sliding scale of decadence, and that the ancients provided an incomparable model. Incomparable not only because of their artistic skill, but because of the society that had been able to foster the mental outlooks that allowed artists in that period to excel. Artistic rebirth, facilitated by social regeneration, ushered in by a republican government, could propel French culture to heights not witnessed since ancient times. Speaking to an audience of young artists at the Louvre in October 1798, Antoine Laurent de Jussieu, president of the recently established Institut, proclaimed, quote, "We are seeing the great days of Greece and Rome shine for us once more." Through enlightened guidance, he argued, the arts had recovered their public role, conveying lessons of morality and civic duty to the entire population. Yet this embrace of classical virtue did not imply disregard for the achievements of more recent masters. Drawing attention to the paintings around them in the museum, Jussieu addressed the students, quote, "It is in this sanctuary, contemplating the immortal works of Raphael, Correggio, and the like, that they will absorb a taste for the true and the beautiful, which are inseparable one from the other. It is in this rich collection that they will discover models of invention, drawing, and color. It is in the school of the celebrated masters who preside over this establishment that they will become worthy successors, sharing their glory." The circumstances and location for Jussieu's speech both point to important institutional changes relating to the art of the past that took place under the Revolution. His words were delivered in the Louvre, which had opened as a museum in August 1793 and had been comprehensively enriched in the previous 4 years by old masters such as Raphael's Transfiguration and Correggio's St. Jerome, as well as by such canonical classical sculptures as the Apollo Belvedere and the Laocoon. These had come into the museum through the plundering of Italian collections following Napoleon's military victory, at this stage actually still Bonaparte's military victories in the Italian peninsula. Jussieu's remarks were directed at winners of the Prix de Rome, the Rome Prize, an award initiated in 1663 that offered winners of the Academy's Prize 5 years' study in the Eternal City. The prize had been suspended in 1793, at the same time as the National Convention abolished the Royal Academy. 2 years later, in October 1795, a reformed Academy of Fine Arts, Académie des Beaux-Arts, was set up under the authority of the newly established Institut. And it was this body that had selected the students for the first promotion of the reinstated competition. This new environment, itself the result of political culture that regarded the revolution as an unprecedented moment of renewal, which wiped away the corrupt secular and spiritual legacy of the past, had profound and in some ways contradictory implications for attitudes towards artistic tradition as they evolved across the 19th century. Though it was neither the earliest public gallery in Europe, nor indeed the first generally accessible collection in Paris, the Louvre's opening was of incalculable importance for artists' and amateurs' knowledge of the art of the past. Conceived as a repository for works confiscated from the monarchy, the aristocracy, and the Catholic Church, the Louvre quickly expanded through expropriations from nations occupied by French forces. Both of these sources brought into the public domain an unprecedented array of painting and sculpture that far exceeded the relatively narrow limits of the inherited canon. At the same time, by isolating these works from their intended settings in monasteries, churches, palaces, and aristocratic residences, and placing them in often unsystematic arrangements on gallery walls, the museum separated artwork's ideological function, now at odds with the values of a secular republic, from their status as objects to be appreciated on largely aesthetic grounds. As the art historian Andrew McLellan has shown, the museum's initial displays followed the precedent set by the presentation of works from the royal collection in the Luxembourg Gallery, which had been opened in 1750, in part to encourage a flowering of history painting in France. The Luxembourg was organized around displays that prioritized formal comparisons, the comparison of the visual qualities of works of art at the expense of historical groupings by period and by national school. As the painter Jean-Baptiste Pierre noted in 1775, the objective, particularly intended for the Academy's prize students bound for Italy, was to prevent, quote, the kind of infatuation that is so common among the young following their arrival in Rome. The exhibition of the King's pictures at the Luxembourg was to have provided those students with a means of comparison to the copies they made there, end quote. 40 years later, this aestheticizing approach to display, adapted in the opening hang of the Louvre, was rapidly abandoned in the face of widespread criticism in favor of more historical criteria that presented individual exhibits within a larger chronological and geographical narrative. With the addition of new waves of new accessions from plundered foreign collections, and after 1815, following their partial return, the museum's displays became increasingly disorganized. Substantial new holdings, such as important acquisitions of Spanish paintings under King Louis Philippe in the 1830s, and the donation of a major bequest by the English collector Frank Hall Standish in 1840, increased the overall sense of disordered eclecticism and encouraged comprehensive reform after Louis Philippe's fall in 1848. This painting by Zurbarán, for example, is one of the pictures that came into the museum with the Standish collection, although actually a lot of the paintings that Standish gave to the Louvre were removed and taken to England by the French King Louis Philippe when he abdicated in 1848. The Second Republic in 1848 saw major changes to the museum as the painter Philippe Auguste Genron, appointed director soon after the February 1848 revolution, joined forces with the new paintings curator, Frédéric Villot, to catalogue its collection properly and present it to the public in a coherent, historically rigorous way. As it evolved into the archetypal Universal Survey Museum, the Louvre thus offered a broadly historicist view of the past, though even under Genron's reorganization, the celebrated Salon Carré remained a privileged showplace for canonical artworks. This is a particular gallery within the Louvre, Salon Carré, because of its square shape, which, as you can see, as late as the 1880s, was dominated by paintings from a variety of schools, which were seen as being, if you like, the masterworks in the Louvre's collection. Viewed from the perspective of the Revolution's second major institutional intervention in the arts, the replacement of the pre-revolutionary Royal Academy by a reformed Academy of Fine Arts, the implications for understanding the place of tradition in contemporary production seem more ambiguous. Central to this reform was the replacement of a two-tier membership open to all artists in favor of one limited to 44 members, self-selected from among senior figures in the profession. Significantly, too, the Academy's members controlled the teaching program through their tuitional responsibilities at the School of Fine Arts, the École des Beaux-Arts, and choice of the annual winners of the Prix de Rome. Historians have generally condemned the Academy as narrow-minded and oppressive, though revisionist accounts suggest a more liberal climate. Certainly, the Fine Arts School was much less open than its relatively flexible Ancien Régime antecedents had been. Yet, as the historian François Fossier argues, the Academy's reputation as a strict champion of antiquity and the Renaissance masters was based less on a reactionary devotion to the art of the past than to a belief that these earlier moments had much to teach the novice who wished to portray nature with noblesse and simplicité, nobility and simplicity. Though often seen as pursuing a rigid policy of cultural reproduction, both in terms of the lessons transmitted to students and in relation to the self-renewal of its membership across the 19th century, the Academy is frequently more complex and contradictory than its critics allow. Artists such as Prudhon and Victor Schnetz, elected as academicians in the first half of the century, or successors such as Jules Breton and Gustave Moreau, appointed under the Third Republic after 1870, demonstrates an eclecticism at odds with the body's reputation for conservative classicism. These are artists, if you actually start looking at the artists who become members of the Academy, really from the 1820s onwards, then it's very hard to maintain this idea of, if you like, a strict set of criteria, a strict party line. They represent a far broader, though still very conservative, spectrum of painters and sculptors active at the period than is often thought to be the case. These conflicted attitudes are highlighted in works by two academicians, Ingres and Paul de la Roche, both of whom produced major pictorial statements on the continuing presence of the past in the Western tradition. Ingres himself is notorious for the apparent contradiction between his fierce defense of antiquity under Renaissance masters, notably Raphael, as inspiring a heightened understanding of nature, and the often idiosyncratic distortions of his representational language. A strong critic of abstract theories of ideal beauty, Ingres insisted on the primacy of nature as the source of art, and of the masters as facilitating its proper apprehension. Here I quote Ingres. The study and contemplation of artistic masterpieces must be used only to render that of nature easier and more fruitful. It must not encourage the rejection of nature, since it is there that all perfections originate and from which they flow. Presenting himself as, quote, a guardian of good precepts and not an innovator, Ingres insisted that everything that artists needed for creative invention could be found in past example. Just as in his own practice, Ingres insisted that Raphael offered an infallible route to originality, so in Western culture more generally, I quote, men who pursue literature and the arts are all Homer's children. The Apotheosis of Homer, unveiled in the Louvre in 1827, sets out to confirm this precept by displaying the poet's wide influence from the ancient world to the 18th century. The group of people arrayed around Homer in the background, on the higher parts of the staircase, tend to be figures from antiquity, although Raphael, on the left-hand side, is admitted to their company. And generally speaking, in the foreground, we have a group of moderns, figures like Poussin, the painter, Racine, the dramatist, Molière, the dramatist, and others, mainly from the 17th century. Embodied by an array of writers, composers, and artists who stand in broadly segregated ranks, separating ancients from moderns, the Western tradition is imagined as an assembly of disciples of the blind poet, who sits impassive and strangely absent in their midst. Similarly, as the art historian Susan Siegfried has noted, Ingres struggles to form a unified whole out of the assembled acolytes, many of whom seem merely collaged into the scene, indifferent or unaware of their role within the overall intellectual community to which Ingres has recruited them. much of the work's doctrinal purpose is concealed from the uncultivated viewer in the array of Greek and Latin texts inscribed on the steps beneath the seated poet. Here, Ingres lengthily quotes Longinus and Quintilian, the former praising, quote, the imitation and the emulation of illustrious writers who've lived before us, while the latter, Quintilian, recommends modesty and circumspection in judging our antecedents. Ingres thus reaffirms the validity and vitality of tradition as a fertile source of creativity. When he proclaims, quote, everything has been done, everything has been discovered, our task is not to invent, but to continue, this is not a counsel of despair on his behalf, but an enthusiastic affirmation of a legacy which the artist regards as inexhaustible. Ingres' apparently confident embrace of tradition contrasts with Delaroche's despairing sense of having arrived on the scene after his creative forerunners had completed the harvest, comments that I mentioned earlier on. Such an attitude sits awkwardly with the commission he received in 1836 to paint a vast panoramic assembly of great artists to decorate the hemicycle lecture theatre of the École des Beaux-Arts, the School of Fine Arts. By this point, however, Delaroche had apparently overcome his reluctance to measure himself against the past and increasingly looked in his own work to compete with the masters by treating canonical themes, particularly from religious history. His mural, which dominated the auditorium where the school's successful graduates formally received their Prix de Rome awards, places the rising generation literally and metaphorically under the shadow of the past. Just as the school's prize winners are greeted with public acclaim as they cross the podium to accept their prize, so in Delaroche's mural, fame kneels forward, preparing to distribute laurel crowns to the new students who aspire to join their illustrious predecessors. And the figure of fame is this naked female kneeling in the foreground. This is above an area much like this one, where the students would come up, they'd receive their prizes, and fame would be shown sort of casting laurels down towards them. So there's a certain sort of porous relationship between the representation on the wall and the events taking place within real space. Yet the scene overall taken, I mean, this is the center, this is the left-hand side, this is the right-hand side. The scene overall offers oddly muted validation. The three classical figures in the center behind fame, the architect Ictinus, the sculptor Phidias, and the painter Apelles, gaze out impassively or appear lost in gloomy thought, while the artists assembled to either side engage in conversation and, with few exceptions, take no notice of events unfolding within the auditorium. In contrast to Ingres' relentlessly didactic glorification of the classical tradition, Delaroche offers little more than a historicist pageant. Though he divides painters between colorists on one side and draftsmen on the other, it's hard to see any thematic structure or message regarding the past's enduring relevance for ongoing cultural vitality. One thing does stand out, though. If the largest group is Italian, 38 of the figures out of 67, French artists come a clear second. There are 13 representatives, numbering more than the Dutch, Spanish, German, and English forces combined. This is unsurprising given the mural's location and its place within an institutional history openly designed to elevate the national school to the heights achieved by its ancient and modern European counterparts. At the same time, however, France's substantial presence among this assembly of exemplary masters points to a re-evaluation that would have substantial consequences in the century that separates Delaroche's mural from Denis'. As McClellan points out, the idea that France could boast of a native school comparable to those of Italy or the Low Countries had been promoted since the 17th century. And indeed, turning the boast into reality was central to the Academy's initial purpose. To this end, McClellan describes the Luxembourg Gallery, which I mentioned a moment ago, as the first museum in Europe intended to represent, indeed to invent, and promote a national artistic tradition. Though much of its spaces featured a mixture of schools, the former throne room in the Luxembourg displayed work only by native artists, offering a first draft of what French art history might look like. French art was equally prominent in the Louvre, and in 1797, a Musée spécial de l'École française, special museum of the French school, was established in the former palace at Versailles. Some 20 years later, in 1818, the Luxembourg Gallery reopened as a museum of contemporary French art, an initiative then unmatched by other nations. And here on the right is a very much later representation of the interior of the Luxembourg Museum, with the audience looking at largely academic paintings by artists who were still alive. This is a museum of living artists or artists who had died within the previous 18 years. After 18 years, these paintings were moved to the Louvre. Important too, and this is what I'm talking about is on the right here, on the left here, important too in promoting an overarching cultural narrative of French art was the Musée des Monuments Français, the Museum of French Monuments, which existed from 1796 to 1816. Established by the antiquarian Alexandre Le Noir, who forged the debris of revolutionary iconoclasm into an evocative journey through a history of sculpture, French sculpture, from the 13th to the 16th centuries. Working primarily with architectural fragments and tomb sculpture from desecrated sites such as the Basilica at Saint-Denis, Le Noir sought to highlight the 16th century as a moment of French artistic supremacy that contrasted with the barbarism of the Middle Ages and the decadence of the Ancien Régime. Despite his own disdain for medieval sculpture, the displays at Le Noir's museum in the Petit Augustin provided the foundations for a reappraisal of medieval work that continued during the Restoration after 1815, encouraged by figures such as Victor Hugo and Prosper Mérimée, and set the stage for a more comprehensive history of French art in the second half of the 19th century. During the 1840s and 50s, this change in critical understanding of French art gathered pace, as figures such as Watteau, Chardin, and the Le Nain brothers re-emerged within a narrative that promoted the native school and played down any historical debt to Italian artists. The Le Nain brothers, in particular, became emblems of a newly valued French art. Their peasant scenes highlighted over their more conventional production, their provincial roots used to obscure their ties to the Academy. Instead, admirers praised what they call their Gallic vigor, expressed in an anti-classical language, apparently inspired by an authenticity enriched by their contacts with what was called that humble race of day laborers and peasants, from which they were falsely claimed to originate. Among those most committed to promoting this homegrown French history of art, the critic Jules Castagnery openly valued art as an expression of its immediate environment. Art is indigenous or it doesn't exist, he declared in 1866. It is the expression of a given society, its mentality, habits, and history, or it's nothing. It grows from the soil, the climate, the race, or it is characterless. Judged by such standards, he admitted, quote, "We have never had French painting in France." Castagnery echoed critics who accused Italian influence, encouraged by François Ier at Fontainebleau in the 16th century, for stifling native French art inherited from the Middle Ages in favor of a superficial foreign style that flourished under royal absolutism and later rigidified into academic art. Thanks to the Italians, quote, this is Castagnery again, French painting was killed outright, replaced by, quote, a second-hand art, an art inspired by other people's art, rather than growing out of the bowels of everyday life. Such a diagnosis, predominantly embraced on the left during the Second Empire, was expressed in various forms by figures as influential as the architect Eugène Viollet-le-Duc and the art historian Louis Courageau, an outspoken adversary of the Italian tradition as it had supposedly infected academic doctrine. In a series of lectures delivered at the École du Louvre between 1887 and 1896, Courageau declared that art must be, quote, rigorously attuned to the nature of our temperament. It must seamlessly, quote, re-establish the chain of tradition by harmonizing with the nation's ethnic character, make every voice of the popular soul sing, and make every fiber of the national soul vibrate. Courageau also accused François I of disrupting the popular wellspring of cultural expression through autocratic intervention. It was the Valois kings, of whom François I was one, he claimed, who initiated a, quote, de-Gallicanization of France that saw the medieval corporations overtaken by alien ideals embodied in the academies established in the 17th century. Quote, born into a corrupt environment under the anti-national and Roman regime of absolutism, they will always bear the stain which soiled the conception of a neo-Latin France, disloyal to its history and genius. As the Fine Arts Academy flourished, Courageau maintained, the robust individualism that had enriched French art as an expression of the Gallic spirit took refuge in the provinces. The 17th century, not only in France but across Europe, had fostered a centralized aristocratic culture whose character explained, quote, the abortion of modern art, its groping in the shadows, its anti-national and anti-popular nature in most Western nations. Courageau's hostility was symptomatic of a broader challenge to the dominance of Italianist classicism that developed after 1870. On one level, this reaction expressed failing confidence in the viability of the classical tradition as a continuing resource for contemporary art, a stance which itself stemmed from the erosion of humanist values in the face of social, political, and scientific transformation. Critics' growing hostility to the Academy, expressed in hostile responses to the Prix de Rome and its winners' subsequent careers, was echoed by the state itself, which gradually retreated from administrative involvement in artistic education and display to focus on what was proclaimed to be its disinterested role as a generous but even-handed patron. the proliferation of art museums and exhibiting venues, the encyclopedic international displays of historical and contemporary art at Exposition Universelle. This is the 1900 exhibition of the history of French decorative art, which was held at the Petit Palais, as well as growing access to high-quality reproductions in books and journals, all fostered an eclectic historicism, which relativized previously dominant narratives of Western art. Fragmented, too, was a sense of the transcendent principles upon which the classical tradition lay its claim to authority, as it found itself increasingly challenged by aesthetic ideals expressive of subjective experience, rooted in, quote, the display of individual impressions. Many historians and critics, for whom tradition still represented a necessary foundation for artistic vitality, but who dismissed the Academy as a spent force, sought to redefine France's place within Europe through a form of cultural repatriation. In 1880, Charles-Philippe de Chenevière, former director of fine arts and a tireless advocate of the classical tradition, claimed that France itself had become synonymous with, quote, the great tradition of universal art, art that transcends all frontiers, in contrast to other schools which merely produce, quote, their own art, local currency. This elevation of France as the supreme refuge of universal values, whose guardianship it had inherited from Greece and Rome, was advocated in the early decades of the 20th century by the royalist movement, Action Française. These are people who want to restore the monarchy to France after its abolition in 1792. Action Française cultural theorists, such as the critic and art historian Louis Dimier, continued to champion the classical tradition, while shifting the focus away from the High Renaissance, promoted by the Academy, towards a later generation of artists credited with rescuing French art from provincialism through their work at Fontainebleau under Francis I, François Ier. Royalists embraced French classicism as the cultural expression of absolutism, whose greatest achievements they associated with such masters of the 17th century as Racine, the playwright, and the painter Poussin. They thus credited the country's achievement of artistic maturity to institutional intervention in the form of the monarchy, rather than to any supposed national temperament. The superiority of French art, from such a perspective, relied upon preserving institutions that safeguarded continuing respect for order, hierarchy, and discipline in all areas of life. The collapse of these institutions, from the Royal Academy to the Bourbon monarchy, meant that for royalists such as Dimier, the very viability of tradition after 1789 had been fatally undermined. Such views were challenged by inheritors of Viollet-le-Duc and Courageau, more sympathetic to understanding France's artistic achievement as rooted in an ethnic identity originating in ancient Gaul and surviving despite repeated military and cultural invasions. From the mid-19th century on, critics sympathetic to ethnic nationalism located the flowering of French tradition in the nation's medieval cathedrals and lamented that continuing artistic vitality had been compromised by François I's cosmopolitanism. Yet despite this betrayal and its damaging consequences for an authentically national art, critics and historians mapped a resistant strain evident in Poussin, habitually praised for his roots in rural Normandy, de Le Nain in the middle at the top, Chardin top right, Watteau bottom left, Corot in the middle, and Cézanne. This is the sort of alternative, if you like, French national genealogy. Cézanne was praised, for example, by a critic called Armand Fourreau in 1909 as, quote, a descendant of those good and faithful workers who built the cathedrals. The idea of Cézanne's Frenchness being sort of advanced by such a comparison. Such affiliations stressed the specificity of French art as the expression of a shared mentality, which, unlike its counterparts in Italy, Germany, or Spain, and despite external pressures, was credited with enjoying a uniquely unbroken history of achievement. Such conception of tradition values past art as the expression of a supposed identity that survives historical change and encapsulates a shared but localized view of the world. By contrast, for its supporters, French artistic tradition embodies what the nationalist politician Maurice Barrès described as, quote, a French truth, which articulates a way of judging life, a way of feeling it. No longer measured against a potentially disabling genealogy of incomparable masters from the past, extending from Athens to papal Rome, French artists could identify with a pedigree defined in terms of racial affinity rather than civilizational absolutes. Since the publication in 1890 of his essay Definitions of Neo-Traditionalism, Maurice Denis had thought a great deal about the art of the past and its relationship to contemporary production. His remarkable debut as a theoretician is, at least in part, a critique of academicism and a defense of an anti-naturalist tradition stretching from ancient Egypt through the artists of the Trecento and Quattrocento to the nascent symbolist movement of which he formed part. His conversion in 1898 to what he calls the classical method, a pictorial practice based upon shared rules rather than subjective sensation, had a marked shift towards an aesthetic more compatible with academic idealism and represents a reappraisal of the classical that is at once artistic and political. You can see the sort of classical inspiration in this two scenes from a series of murals showing the history of Psyche. In 1904, Denis lamented that the revolution's destruction of social and cultural hierarchies, along with their supporting institutions, had given rise to, quote, an era of temperaments and personalities, whose fragmentation prevented the emergence of a truly national art. Throughout his career, however, Denis remained torn between a naive gauche anti-naturalism associated with the piety of the Italian primitives and a Greco-Latin art, which he too frequently found cold and charmless. Tracing the history of French art in his ceiling at the Petit Palais, Denis seems less responsive to the militant classicism of Action Française than to the more accommodating approach of his friend Adrien Mitoir, who you see on the left in this triptych by Denis. A Catholic poet and theorist, Mitoir argued that French art and literature represented a unique synthesis that brought together naturalism and idealism, the Gothic and the classical, northern and southern cultures. Denis' ceiling echoes many of his ideas. Both the Gothic and the Grand Siècle become pivotal points, and both show artist and monarch united around a common project. François I's prominence indicates Denis' recognition of the 16th century as a seminal moment in the history of French art, though one in which he is reluctant to explicitly highlight indebtedness to Italy. Instead, Denis, like Mitoir, celebrates an uninterrupted continuity of French art, reconciling the Gothic and the classical rather than presenting them as starting points for alternative traditions. dividing lines are crossed in small but subtle ways. The contemporary sculptor Aristide Maillol, a classicist, appears dressed in the first scene of Denis' murals as a medieval mason, Gothic artist, while students from Denis' Atelier d'Art Sacré, students of the Studio of Sacred Art, an organization that Denis founded after the First World War, pose as 17th century students of the École de Rome. Significantly, too, the dome's circular format juxtaposes the Impressionist masters and their medieval predecessors, recalling Mitoi's celebrated analogy between the two, between the Gothic and the Impressionist, in an essay in 1901. What the critic Paul Léon describes, as I mentioned at the outset, as the triumph of French art is then figured as a triumph of unity, an essentially nationalist vision that reconciles competing histories of French art, and indeed of France itself, in a reassuring assertion of unbroken cultural achievement. Thank you. Okay.
Thank you, Neil. This was really wonderful. There are so many things that came across that it's difficult to pick up one and just ask questions. But I'm sure that many of you will have questions on the many aspects of your lecture. So, ¿quién rompe el fuego? ¿Nombro voluntarios o voluntarias o alguien se presenta voluntario? ¿Tienes una pregunta? ¿No? ¿Tú tienes una pregunta? ¿No tenéis ninguna pregunta? Bueno, haré la pregunta, la primera, si queréis, y después hacéis una vosotros, porque seguro que habéis estado escuchando atentamente, entonces seguro que tendréis preguntas. So, I'll do the first question. One thing, talking about tradition, you have talked about tradition and artists in the 19th century. As I was taking notes, I was thinking of art critics, which are not precisely artists writing about art, but art critics writing about art. And parallel to this question of a national art, of a French national tradition, there was the discourses on modernity and originality, on breaking the rules of the academy and of tradition, of seeing, of wanting to break this tradition, this continuity, and aspiring precisely on the opposite, on the discontinuity, on the fragment, and not on the whole. So, for example, the artists you mentioned, which are not all academicians,
no,
by no means, you had at the same time the maybe apocryphal thing of Pissarro saying that he wanted, in order to have a real good art, the Louvre should be burnt. And he was not the only one. He was maybe the one to put it apparently in such a direct way, but the idea of breaking with the tradition of the privilege of the new, the privilege of originality, which is not only the new, and the new idea of originality was exactly contemporary to what you were what you were describing. So how can we? It's more that I just want to know your opinion more than a question. I don't know whether I have a question, but how the discourse on the creation of a national French art goes parallel to the idea very much ingrained in French art criticism about the construction of originality, which is exactly, or wants to be, exactly the opposite.
I think there are several things that one can say here. First of all, you mentioned Pissarro. I think in terms of thinking about artists themselves, and artists who are regarded both by their contemporaries and generally speaking by art historians as being in some ways in the vanguard, however one wants to describe that, I think there's increasing recognition that these artists themselves are much more receptive to and engage in a dialogue with the art of the past than had previously been credited in terms of, if you like, the sort of the heroic history of modern art. It's pretty clear. We've had exhibitions recently, for example, on the Impressionists and the art of the past. Degas is a striking example, Renoir probably even more so. But again, one can look at across the board at artists like Monet as well, and there is this sense of a much more judicious use of past precedent than is often credited. The same can be said of artists of a later generation, Picasso himself, Derain. I think the difference, though, is when one gets to, if you like, the generation of artists who begin to flourish after 1900, and it's something in a sense that comes out of what I said somewhere near the end about the opportunities for looking at the art of the past, either directly or indirectly in reproductive form, that this is really, around 1900, is really the beginning of the moment which, because of travel, because of cheap publications, artists can begin to have a much more all-embracing notion of the past, which surpasses the shores of Europe. Picasso may be interested in ancient Spanish sculpture, but he's also interested in African masks. And the same would be true of an artist like Derain. So again, there's a dialogue with the past, but it's what one does with it, and also the ways in which artists, in looking to the past, understand its relationship across a sense of historical, if you like, as part of a historical genealogy with their practice in the present. The other thing I think that needs to be said, as I said at the outset, the perspective that I've been privileging in looking at this is that of cultural conservatives who are trying to maintain some semblance of cultural continuity, though they don't know whether that should be a cultural continuity based upon, if you like, an Italianate tradition or a nativist one. But at the same time, in those circles, there is a great deal of antipathy to what they see as being the quite deliberate rejection of the past, both by artists within the academy, because academic art is seen as having, if you like, a misunderstood relationship with the past, that it's not, that the past no longer, if you like, organically informs present-day production, but is an eclectic source that can be mined indiscriminately by artists in a sort of a historicist fashion. So that's seen as being, if you like, a relationship with the past which has gone wrong. But equally, conservative critics are extraordinarily disdainful of what they see as being the consequences of artistic individualism amongst, if you like, the up-and-coming vanguard. And those initiatives themselves understood as a repudiation of the arts of the past is seen as being symptomatic of a much broader social breakdown. That it's not just art that needs to be rooted in a sense of cultural growth. It's society itself. And so the two tend to go together. In terms of, if you like, more, to use the word tendentiously, advanced critics, even there, you look at something like André Salon, for example, there's still a much more nuanced sense of what the past has to offer the more advanced artists of the present than one would ever imagine. Apollinaire, for example, is an admirer of the painter Émile Bernard in his classicizing phase. You know, he regards him as a great master. So there's this idea of, if you like, opposing camps is one that doesn't really sustain much analysis.
Yeah, but it's like an inheritance of modernism, you know, at being either you are an academic, a conservative, a avant-garde artist, but you have very definite and non-connected fields.
And it's not like
and that is a construction of modernist art history, which is no more acceptable by new standards in a way. No new perspectives on what research can be.
It only really works if you think that the study of early 20th century art should confine itself to about 30 artists. Once you actually start to think about artistic production in a more broadly based way, in a more historical way, then you realize that these arguments, these debates, place these groups very, very differently, and that the sort of privileged avant-garde that has dominated art historical discourse really since the Second World War is this tiny peripheral group. Now then, we might say, yes, they're tiny and peripheral, but they're extremely important. I wouldn't deny that. But nonetheless, if one is to actually develop a viable history of 20th century art, it needs to be seen from an angle that that's not dominated to the exclusion of all else by this small coterie of painters.
Absolutely. Yep, maybe. Thomas and you, later?
Yes, thank you very much. I really enjoyed your talk and really have been looking forward to it as well. In order to open it up, because it's quite rich, and I think it takes us to the detail of political life and ideological life in France in various moments of the 19th century. But I wanted to open it up maybe for the students in terms of the sources and what they are telling us. I think one of the words that I'm picking up very frequently, and it occurs both in your sources and in your own discourse, is the idea of vibrancy and vitality, which is a metaphor, of course, when you're referring to the canon in terms of a vibrancy or kind of emotions that are picked up from the confrontation with the tradition. It's metaphorical, it's not very objective, and I found it very thrilling that at one moment you quote Louis Courageau, and he's also talking about every fiber of the national soul which should vibrate. So my question there, and that's the first question, is do you think there is an intersection here with medical thinking and maybe perhaps also with the introduction of electricity And that's, maybe you can, and I have a second question.
No, I mean, you say this is a metaphorical language. I don't think it's a metaphorical language that necessarily depends on those. I mean, I know what you're thinking about, Charcot and Duchesne de Boulogne and things like that, but no, I honestly, I think that sort of rather imagistic language you could find earlier than some of these things. And the sort of faire vibrer l'âme nationale, I mean, it's this sort of sense of sort of animism in a way. I think it's a fairly stock metaphor rather than one which relies on these sorts of developments. No, I'd be surprised.
Well, and then a follow-up ties into this one. I have a name for you, Henri Jouin.
Oh, yeah.
And how to place him is not a conservative. He's not in either of these two conservative camps which you have identified. He's rather a Republican who really makes a career out of the Third Republic's new project for France. And he's a Republican. He's severely Catholic. And he's very much concerned with factory workers, with the proletarian layers living in France. So he, in a way, he's a socialist as well. So he fits into different boxes. Now, I've been working on Henri Jouin, and he says very interesting things because he is someone who's very much preoccupied with French art being a dominant presence in the international stage, particularly sculpture. He's obsessed about how sculpture, French sculpture, and then he thinks that you can notice that in the exhibition of 1878. French sculpture has always been, in a way, naturally gifted, so also its DNA coming from France is it's naturally gifted to communicate more directly and more immediately. Therefore, it is also ideal as a medium in order to address factory workers. So he's mixing all of these things up. And he's using electricity as a metaphor in very interesting ways. I get the sense that he takes this from the spiritualists, which is another little club going around in France. But he's using electric metaphors in very interesting ways because sculpture is talking to the masses and it's really thrilling the masses. It's taking possession of the souls of the masses. So I find this very interesting. I just wanted to have your comment on Jouin and then just pass the word to everyone.
Well, Jouin is interesting. He's somebody I've come across in a number of different contexts. He, for example, writes the first sort of major biography of Charles Lebrun. And it's funny because even there, I was reading this through because, I mean, one of the things very striking in terms of advocates of French classicism in the Third Republic is that they say classicism is important, but they always fall back on Poussin. And they very, very rarely express much enthusiasm for artists in the academy during that period. And if you read Jouin's biography of Lebrun, he himself actually says at one point, that Lebrun is an interesting artist, but he's going to make no great claims for him. And it seems sort of symptomatic of a slight sort of parallax between a sense of wanting to promote French classicism as, if you like, the pivot of a national tradition conceived in a certain way, combined with a certain diffidence about what that art actually looks like. And I think one of the reasons that French classicism is sort of promoted so enthusiastically, and this would be true of a royalist critic like Louis Dimier, a little sort of generation after Jouin, is because of Racine and Corneille, it's because of Boileau, it's because of Bossuet, it's because of the literary impact of classicism, which they don't quite find in painting or sculpture, so there's same satisfaction. So Jouin, as I say, is interesting from that point of view. More to the point of what you're talking about, Jouin, I guess I've sort of encountered before through David Danger, He writes this 2-volume biography and catalogue raisonné of David d'Angers, who is a 19th century sculptor, avid Republican, devoted his entire career until his death in something like 1856, I think it was, to producing both statues, busts, and medallions of great men and women, with a very clear sense that these will, to go back to what you were saying about workers, will have a moral impact, a moralizing impact on ordinary French people, on particularly the working orders, and will encourage them to improve their lives, to try and strive to become more successful in their professional lives, to devote themselves, if you like, to attaining a higher degree of personal and social ambition. So Juin is a big advocate of David d'Angers. He writes this 2-volume book. He publishes David d'Angers' letters. David d'Angers, Juin is one of these people who writes extensively, but David d'Angers is certainly, amongst his biggest objects of interest. And one of the things he consistently does is he plays down the more radical aspects of David's republicanism. He tries to sort of turn him into a moderate Republican who would be more congenial for a sort of mainstream Republican audience in the 1880s, 1890s. And I'm surprised to hear you call him a socialist. My sense is, and I'm sure there are things that justify that, but my sense in his writings is that there's always been a much more hesitant attitude towards the Republican project. That it's, if you like, it's a civic republicanism which is much more in tune with, if you like, the possibilists than it would be with any sort of more radical republicanism during that sort of, he's a sort of Jules Ferry Republican, it seems to me. But I think he exemplifies very well the ways in which French art historians and sort of French cultural historians more generally are sort of grappling with trying to put together certain histories of French art which exalt the nation. Not in a sort of, in his case and in many others, not in a sort of obvious breast-beating way, saying, we're the greatest, but actually sort of putting the thing together such that there is a sense of there being a tradition in French art which can hold its own with other nations. And as I say, frequently that comes across as being, well, Italy clearly is incomparable, but it stopped being incomparable in the 17th century, but we've just kept going. We invented the Gothic, we had a little bit of a sort of a rocky patch in the 14th, 15th centuries, but then, we really sort of got a grip, and since then, we've been the one country that has had an uninterrupted history of artistic achievement. And that's the way, we don't have the greatest artists in the world. We don't have a Leonardo, we don't have a Michelangelo, but we do have many, many figures who over the ages have contributed significantly to a notion of a European culture and a cultural tradition.
Hi, I would like to ask you a question. That is, in what way do you see, and if you see it, an expression of or any identification of the expansion of the French Empire towards the colonies, that is like the genocide and the
That's a good question.
In the history of France, in this period exactly, like this 19th century, there is like a huge expansion of French Empire, especially in Africa. And the other question is, in what way do you see this kind of nationalism in relation to the nationalism that we are seeing now in Europe, especially there's relation with fascism and the growing of nationalist movements and far right, of course. And in what way do you think that this kind of research can offer different kinds of ways of seeing this rise of nationalism?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. To start with the first question first, the relationship with colonialism is a real one, I think, although it's somewhat indirect. One of the aspects of the French colonial enterprise, and it's in a sense somewhat similar to what one would find dealing with British colonialism or Belgian colonialism, but I think it's particularly marked in France, is this idea of universalism. That the sense that French culture represents universal values more effectively than any other European nation's culture, and that those values can be transmitted to less developed nations as a means of enhancing their passage towards higher civilization is one of the alibis of the colonial enterprise. And within that, education, clearly, in the French case, plays an absolutely crucial role. So in some ways, I think one probably could make the argument more strongly in terms of thinking about the way in which French literature was used as one of the ingredients in producing a sort of transnational sense of French civilization. But the visual arts are there as well. That there is this sense of producing French citizens who might be in Martinique or might be in Algeria, but who are united by a common lingua franca, the French language and the French culture that language has been used to articulate and bring to maturity. So I think that's one of the ways one might think about that. In terms of the present day, when I started, I've been working on this for a long time, so when I started out on this, I think one of the things that really first got me interested in nationalism was one of the first manifestations of the return of nationalism in Europe, which is to say, the wars that accompanied the breakup of Yugoslavia. And I was interested at that stage in the ways in which cultural patrimony was one of the pawns in all of this. The destruction of cultural monuments, particularly mosques, for example, was a very significant ingredient in trying to sort of not just sort of redraw the boundaries within the sort of shifting ethnic demographics and geographical demographics of former Yugoslavia, but it was also a way of sort of erasing histories and the ethnic and sort of proto-national traditions that were sort of scaffolded upon that. And up until that point, I had worked primarily on aspects of the French left and the visual arts. My doctoral work was on utopian socialism in mid-19th century France and its relationship to aesthetics. And I'd been interested in thinking about, because of my interest in the relationship between political theory and aesthetics, I thought, looking at the right, as it evolved in France around the turn of the 19th, 20th century, might be quite an interesting project, particularly since it sort of intersected with debates that developed in the 1980s about what I mentioned at one point in the talk, this idea of the return to order, the way in which artists were understood after the First World War to temper their commitment to the avant-garde and to try and sort of propitiate a resurgent right by introducing sort of classicizing elements into their work. Artists like Picasso, for example, in the immediate post-war period. And the more work I did, the less convinced I was by this argument, or the less convinced I was that this was something that was in any way specific to the interwar period or to an understanding of the avant-garde. And it made me sort of rethink the whole way in which one might approach understanding how artists respond to debates about cultural identity. I think I'm sort of inherently cautious about drawing sort of neat lines across history between particular periods and saying, oh, well, we can learn from X, Y, and Z in terms of, how things develop today. So I wouldn't say, well, I think my work teaches us this about what's happening now, because the circumstances of the resurgence of nationalism in the early 21st century are really very different in many ways from what was happening in the 1890s, 1900s. At the same time, it's clear, again, if one looks at the sort of post-Yugoslav situation, that it's important to understand the ways in which different forms of cultural activity can be conscripted within nationalist discourse, and how artists, sometimes almost inadvertently, are able to contribute to understandings or formations of what the nation is understood to be, what the essentializing discourses that emerge all too easily within a sort of nationalist antinomy between us and them. I've been more interested in that sense. I've done a certain amount of work on sort of popular artists working in the United States today, artists who basically sell their work by mail order and who advertise their work on the internet, the best known of whom would be Thomas Kinkade, who at one point was regarded as being one of the world's wealthiest artists. Painters who sell work to a very, very broad range socially, and who talk up certain sorts of understandings of what it means to be American, both in terms of American history, the sort of the God-given nature of the Constitution, for example, the rugged independence of the American West, the ways in which current political events can be understood from a relatively polarizing nationalist position. So there's one artist who interests me a good deal, for example, called John Mcnaughton, who was hugely successful in producing sort of reworked history paintings, highly critical of Barack Obama, and who's since made vast amounts of money eulogizing Donald Trump. He recently published an allegory, in all seriousness, an allegory called Draining the Swamp, based upon Lutz's Washington Crossing the Delaware, in which we have Donald Trump and his entourage taking the place of Washington and his troops crossing the swamp. So I've been interested in thinking about, how images like this circulate in the present and what they tell us about, if you like, susceptibilities of certain social groups towards nationalist discourse, and how the visual can help aggravate certain attitudes, can help build up certain imaginary communities, if you like, of individuals who feel a certain affinity with a particular ideological faction or a particular imaginary historical genealogy. But looking at the visual arts is, I think, at one and the same time, a fairly sort of peripheral, but also an extremely important way of accounting for the emergence of nationalist feeling, because it does speak to some of the ways in which nationalism addresses the emotions. Nationalism doesn't necessarily prosper through rational argument, but it does work through a much more insidious dialogue with individual emotion. And maybe less today, where the range of visual stimuli is much broader, whether one's talking about the internet, TV, the movies, whatever. But certainly historically, I think one of the ingredients that plays into the ways in which we can understand the formation of certain conceptions of collective identity is through looking at the ways in which the visual arts have worked in specific historical situations to mold particular attitudes, to foster particular historical genealogies, and to marginalize particular groups. So I think, I don't know if that seems like a satisfactory answer to your question, but it's the ways I'm sort of working to justify myself. I think, when one's working as an academic in something like art history, it's not always easy to feel that what you're doing has, particular relevance to the larger public discourse, particularly since I think, as academics generally in the humanities, the last few decades has been one of increasing institutional marginalization. So, one has, I think, to have a fairly realistic sense of the limitations of what one's actually able to achieve.
I think we are.
It's because the class goes until 9.
Well, that's.
Well, I will have just the last question. Since first, thank you for your very rich presentation. And since we have two students, one of them is studying the role of museums today, and the other about gender, the role of women in art history. Mm-hmm. So could you please give them and to all an advice about how to conduct their research?
Wow.
Just to close a short question, a short answer, please.
Well, it depends what your research is, but it's pretty clear that the last couple of decades, one of the good things about art history, for all its limitations, is that it has recognized just how narrow its foundations have been historically, both if one's thinking about something like gender, just in terms of the sorts of arts that was seen as being worthwhile as an object of study, which was essentially, until relatively recently, it consisted pretty much entirely of canonical white male artists. And also not thinking particularly closely about the sort of institutional structures within which artists produced, consumed, and validated. Art historians, again, until relatively recently, have been much more concerned about thinking of elucidating the meaning of individual works. It's been a sort of a fairly narrow hermeneutic exercise. You can't say that now. You can't say that really since the 1980s. It's changed a good deal. So things like museum studies have prospered. I think there is an increasing understanding that what one is dealing with in dealing with art objects is an exercise that has to involve taking into consideration questions of reception as much as production, and in a field like that, something like art criticism is extremely important, but so is an understanding of the role of the museum historically. And there is a huge literature which has risen to that challenge. And I think, the more that people do, the more we understand just how central these institutions have been in defining values over the past 2 centuries or so, since the public museum really becomes a widespread institution. Obviously, as well, to take the second part, in terms of gender studies, now I think one is the rise of feminism in art history was, I think, in some respects, the most salutary kick in the pants that it got. Social history of art, as it developed in the 80s, did a great deal to revitalize the discipline. But then feminism's critique of social art history, reminding social art historians of the limitations of the ways in which they themselves, mainly masculine art historians, had sort of reconceptualized what it was to be an art historian, was still defective. It was still too narrow. And it wasn't just a question of saying, hey, remember there were loads of women artists that nobody's taking any interest in. It went beyond that. It went beyond that by asking about how we can reconceptualize gender relations through a much more nuanced understanding of the history of representation informed by feminist studies. And I think that's still an extremely important and extremely valuable contribution. I think, to some extent, final point, art history at the moment, I don't know what you think, but it's not as interesting as it was just 10 years ago. I think it has become somewhat depoliticized again. The most interesting things that are happening to some degree are in what would be described as visual and media studies rather than art history itself. And art history is sort of going back to its bad old ways, though I don't think it can ever be as bad as it was before. And even that sounds too dismissive. It's easy to forget the enormous intellectual inheritance that art historians in the 70s and 80s had to look back to. But I think when the generation before ours came to dominate the field, they looked back on a post-war situation which had been fairly uninspiring. That the great masters of art history, the German art historians of the late 19th century and the pre-war period, had been sort of somewhat forgotten. And what social art history in some ways did was certainly provide a way of rethinking both those art historians who were seen as predecessors, but also rethinking, possibly in more critical ways, those art historians whose methods were seen as being different from what was being developed in the 80s and 90s, but who nonetheless represented an enormous intellectual tradition. And to some extent, as I say, I think that's slightly gone off the boil at the moment, which is maybe not an entirely good thing, you know? Anyway, that's enough.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Bona nit. Gràcies a tothom.